Hello, and welcome to this high-level political forum side event on enhancing policymaking during an emergency, lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. This event is led by the International Science Council and the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. My name is Ines Hassan, and I am the ISD's coordinator for the COVID-19 Outcome Scenarios Project, an exercise to help prepare for the mid to long-term consequences of this COVID-19 pandemic. Before we get started, let's go over some housekeeping. Firstly, this session is being simultaneously translated in French, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese and Portuguese. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom today, you can hear the simultaneous translations by clicking on the interpretation button at the bottom. Secondly, this webinar will be recorded and will be made afterwards, available afterwards. And lastly, we welcome your comments in the chat function. If you have a question for our panelists, please write this in the Q&A box. It's a packed schedule today, but we hope to get to as many of your questions as possible. I'm delighted to now introduce your panel of experts for today's discussion. This is moderated by the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, Mami Mizutori. Mami has been in this role since 2018 and served before that for more than 25 years in the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mami will be joined today by Peter Piot, who requires no introduction. Peter Piot is the director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and a Handa Professor of Global Health. He was the founding executive director of UNAIDS and the Under Secretary General of the United Nations from 1995 until 2008. He also co-discovered the Ebola virus in 1976, pioneering research on HIV and AIDS, particularly in Africa, and he is the special advisor to the President of the European Commission on COVID-19. We're also joined today by Christiane Woopen, who is the director of CERES, the Center for Ethics, Rights, Economics and Social Sciences of Health at the University of Cologne. She worked as a doctor in gynecology and obstetrics before focusing on medical ethics. We're also joined by Elizabeth Jelin, a senior researcher at the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research and at the Institute of Economic and Social Development in Buenos Aires in Argentina. Elizabeth is a social scientist engaged in research in the areas of human rights, social inequalities, gender and family, and the memories of political repression. And last but definitely not least, Claudio Struchiner, who is a professor at the School of Applied Mathematics at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Brazil. He is a medical doctor and a mathematician by training, and his research focuses on infectious disease epidemiology. So all of the panelists we have today are members of the committee overseeing the COVID-19 Outcome Scenarios Project. So before I hand over to Mami, I would like to brief you on the project's goals and the scope. So the International Science Council, along with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and the World Health Organization as observers, has been convening experts from around the world and across varying disciplines to consider the medium to long-term effects of the pandemic so we can be prepared for future challenges. Why is this critical? Well, scientists have long warned us about the events such as this pandemic, but the global community was still caught by surprise in many ways. The uneven response to the pandemic in countries and across the globe has exacerbated existing inequalities. But there has also been phenomenal success in the development of vaccines, diagnostics and new treatments. But again, their distribution remains uneven and there remain many uncertainties about how this pandemic will continue to evolve. So what emerges next will depend on multiple different factors, including the evolution of SARS-CoV-2, government responses, the level of global cooperation, ongoing progress in vaccine development and citizen behavior. Many actors appear to be focused on the short-term pandemic outcomes at the moment, but we all know that decisions today will have an impact on the long-term global health, economic and inequality outcomes. So we really must be prepared for these future challenges. Of course, the outcomes of the pandemic will naturally have an impact on the Sustainable Development Goals, and they already have. And so long-term planning and high-level COVID policies must also align with the SDG goals as well. We're going to be presenting our findings later on this year. But today we will consider how governments and policymakers can enhance policymaking in emergencies like this pandemic, and how they can help us build a pathway to a one world scenario where the pandemic is well controlled across the globe, the majority of the world's population are vaccinated, clear policies are formulated to tackle inequalities and to put us on track towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, where economic recovery is rapid and sustained, and most importantly, COVID-19 is off the global agenda. Right, I will now hand over to the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for Disaster Risk Reduction, Mami Mizutori. Thank you, Mami.
Thank you, Ines. So it's just over 2 years ago since the UNDRR Scientific and Technological Advisory Group and the International Science Council convened a Science and Policy Forum in Geneva. This forum identified knowledge gaps and opportunities to strengthen the contribution of science to reducing disaster risk as set out in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Since then, UNDRR and ISC, we have worked closely together to develop the technical report on Sendai hazards definition and classifications, which cites more than 300 human-made and natural hazards, including biological hazards, importantly for today's event. More than 800 scientists and experts contributed to this very important exercise, and it is an example of the kind of international cooperation that we indeed need to scale up if we are to reach endgame with the COVID-19 pandemic. In joining the COVID-19 Scenarios Project, UNDRR, we had no doubt that it will make a major contribution to guiding governments and policymakers along an effective pathway towards control of the virus and necessary mitigation measures, while also laying a foundation for how the world faces up to future pandemics with better prevention and preparedness. The struggle to end this pandemic is in many ways about improved disaster risk governance at global, regional, and national levels. It is the quality of governance and a focus on inclusion and equality which will determine whether viral control is pursued effectively in each and every country. Much needs to be done to strengthen governance systems to cope with the challenge that lie ahead, challenges which go beyond the development and distribution of vaccines, as important as they are at this very moment. And ultimately, this means building resilience for the next pandemic and providing affordable and easy access to effective vaccines to build a more resilient world where no country, no one is left behind. From the UNDRR's perspective, we know there is a lot of room for improvement in terms of closer alignment between national disaster management authorities and public health authorities. This is a challenge that we have as we support member states to have their national and local strategies for disaster risk reduction in place and monitor reporting against the Sendai Framework global targets to achieve the management of disaster risks before they become a disaster. UN member states adopting the Sendai Framework recognized in 2015 the importance of international cooperation, especially for developing countries whose public health needs are largely unmet in the current level of response to the pandemic. Transformative change is needed in this area if we want an even playing field to fight this virus and to avoid a bad situation getting a lot worse for everyone. Most importantly, UNDRR and ISC advocate for greater understanding of disaster risk in all its complexity, and in order to get there, we depend on the science community to advance our understanding of the systemic nature of risks which flow from and interact with the pandemic, and we need the policymakers to listen and follow the advice of the science community on how to manage and prevent the cascading impacts of disaster risk. So I look forward to the perspective of our very distinguished speakers this afternoon. And with this, let us go into the discussion zone. So the first segment is about policymaking in times of crisis. COVID-19 has shown that governments can act swiftly and resolutely in a crisis, but there has also been missteps. let's admit it. The pandemic has led to unequal responses, unequal impacts at the country level. Science has uncovered much about the virus and made extraordinary, unprecedented progress on vaccine and treatment development. But there is still great uncertainty in regards to the end game as the pandemic continues to evolve. So against this backdrop, my first question is for Peter. And the question is, what has the pandemic taught the global community about policy making thus far? What went well? What didn't? Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Mami, and thank you, Ines, for the introduction and for organizing this. Well, I think the key big questions that the policy had to be dealing with, I would say, summarizing is managing uncertainty, huge amount, because nobody had ever been confronted with what we are dealing with. Secondly, is managing risk and risk perception. And three, I would say, managing trust or lack of trust from the public in whatever it comes. And a few points here. One is that in terms of policy making, I think that rarely before had science advice it's been so prominent in many countries. And even scientists were sometimes, I would say, you could argue that they were, be the main communicators and they're there. And it's interesting that in a recent trust barometer that the company Edelman publishes every year, that the scientists were at the top of the trusted people. For how long, I don't know, but so science advice. And secondly, and that's a bit the other side, is that populism on the political side, but also science skepticism also have been very prominent. It was highly variable between and among countries. In some countries, that was the dominant phase, depending a bit on who's in charge and who's the head of state, for example. But that's also illustrated by, for example, skepticism about vaccines, uptake of vaccines, and so on. Thirdly, I would say as another challenge, and is the need for acute crisis management. People are dying, and we need to take decisions. On the other hand, it's increasingly clear, as Ines said also, that we need a long-term view. That's why the International Science Council exercise is so important. This virus is not going to go away. And so in an ideal world, we would need to take the acute decisions for crisis management and prevention in function of that long-term view. That's extremely difficult and has been pretty absent. And then the fourth point, my last one on this, is that no country can solve this on their own. I mean, of course, local decisions have to be made, but this is a pandemic. By definition, this is a global issue, and regional cooperation in some cases has become very prominent. We saw new examples, for example, in Africa, with the African Union standing up to this challenge, also in Europe, through the EU. But the need for global cooperation and is also illustrated by the enormous inequity in terms of access to vaccines. So I'll stop here because there are many, many more, and I'm sure my colleagues have a lot to say on that as well.
Thank you very much, Peter. Indeed, on one hand, the trust for scientists went up, but also skepticism. But definitely the focus was on science and scientists. And your point about the long-term view is really what we need to be driven by, and the global response. But now I'd like to turn to Claudio and Elizabeth, because we do also want to hear from you about the global response and what's happening globally, but also if you can elaborate and share with us what we can learn from a Latin American perspective, where both of you are from. So first I'd like to give the floor to Claudio, and then after that to Elizabeth. Over to you, Claudio.
Thank you, Mami. Yeah, so I guess that Brazil is the worst case scenario to consider. And I would like to stress Peter's statement, and I think that a more political statement applies here. So science is one of the pillars of democracy. And the attack on science is above all an attack on democracy. And I see Brazil as a testing site on how far deliberate science denial can push the system until it collapses. So in this context, science communication merges with political activism and the defense of a democratic system. I cannot disentangle the two dimensions in a setting like the Brazilian setting. So I would invoke two recent events to synthesize and illustrate the clear intent of Brazil's current administration to downplay the importance of a consensual scientific knowledge. So the first one is the image on the front pages of the main newspapers in the country of President Bolsonaro removing the mask of a young child that he holds onto his lap. And his comments, as the second one, his comments suggesting that individuals that take RNA vaccines could turn into crocodiles. So I am not aware of any other setting facing such challenge, and all technical statements and recommendations have to face the political challenges involved with that. So I guess this is a picture of the scenario that we are living on right now in Brazil, for example. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio. And may I now turn to Elizabeth from what you can tell us from your experience.
First, let me thank the invitation to join such an interesting and important panel. I think that the first thing I want to say is that the pandemic evolved a long time with constant and persistent uncertainty, as Peter mentioned. This is the key learning, to live with uncertainty at all levels and the need for flexibility and rapid responses to shifting changes, to shifting conditions. And I think that different social conditions cannot be dealt with one overall rigid policy. Perhaps Latin America, that is the region of the world with the highest levels of social inequality, show very clearly the effects of policies that try to reach everybody, and social conditions are impossible, make it impossible. The simple example, what does wash your hands mean for populations with no running water? About 1/4 of the world population has no running water. What does stay at home mean for people who have no home, or for those whose daily activities take place on the street or in community spaces and not in homes? Even if they have housing, there may be less than 2 square meters per person inside the house. So what does, and life is not organized according to households. Inequalities in Latin America are rampant among and within countries, as it is in the world as a whole. I checked some data on poverty. Almost 10% of the world population live on an income of less than $1.9 per day. And this has not, depending on the region, it increased a little bit or decreased with the pandemic, but almost all confinement policies were geared for family-based households everywhere. And when community collective organizations were given a role, things went on much better. So nuanced and differentiated policies, in my view, work much better than universal or general ones. And in this, social science is part of the scientific community that has to come to the fore.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Indeed, science is a pillar of democracy. And as you say, Elizabeth, we need to live, unfortunately, in a time of uncertainty, and the uncertainty itself shifting. And as in all disasters, the most vulnerable have been impacted most. But Christiane, can I now turn to you so that you can share with us your thoughts on this topic that we're discussing right now?
Thank you very much, Mami, and thank you all for inviting me, having me here for this very interesting panel. I want to follow up on some aspects that the former speakers said. So first, Claudio mentioned a very strong sentence and said an attack on science is an attack on democracy. I completely agree, and I just want to broaden it and say an attack to science is an attack to humanity. Because science, to learn something, to want to shape our world according to insights and to go ahead in learning something about us, about the world around us, and to shape it accordingly, is something that is an anthropological constant for a human being. And to attack this is actually, for me, an attack on humanity. This saying, I want to stress as well something that Elizabeth alluded already to, and that's that science is more than in the Anglo-American usual understanding of science as natural science, life sciences, and so on. But according to my understanding, sciences also are humanities, social sciences, ethics, philosophy, and so on. That's also science. And that's one of the lessons learned in this pandemic, that we had a too narrow view on pandemic management. There were only few cities or regions where a holistic approach to pandemic management and policy making was supported by councils, expert councils, and so on, that were composed with different disciplines and expertise, also expertise from social workers and so on, who know what is happening in some parts of a city or region. And where this happened, the communication with the people were better. People better understood what happened and what measures were necessary to do. And I think this holistic approach has to be learned. And this is not only about regions or cities or specific landscapes, it's about the whole world. And what we see is a shaming amount of increasing social injustice and inequalities. There are more and more people who are super rich, having more than 100 million US dollar as wealth. Global wealth is increasing, so the pandemic made the world richer, but at the same time there are millions and millions of people in severe poverty, having hunger, as Elizabeth already mentioned. And I think this is something that the world cannot look, it has to look to, yeah, and has to deal with. And we need more and stronger international structures and procedures and contracts and multi-level governance to deal with these shaming phenomena that the pandemic brought to our mind even stronger.
Thank you, Christiane, about telling us where the place that science should occupy in our societies should be, and also reminding us that this recovery from COVID has to be not only resilient but equitable. But now I want to come back to Peter. And Peter, so based on this discussion that we're having today on lessons learned, what new policies are needed to minimize long-term negative consequences of the pandemic?
Thank you, everybody. And I agree with all the comments that were made. And I think that there are specific policies for to prepare for the next pandemic. I mean, as sobering as that may sound, then and of course solve this crisis, which I think from an acute crisis is rapidly evolving into a chronic issue. And I think it's too early to judge really what in the long run, what were the best policies and what not, except that in the short term, we know we can count the deaths, and there have been devastating deaths. You know, I mean, the UK, 127,000 deaths. When you look at Brazil, I mean, that's something that's clearly a failure. But I think what we also should look at is what doesn't work, and I'm just going back on what Christiane also said, is that if we ignore the inequalities in society that really lead to a lack of resilience for entire sectors in society. What doesn't work also is the illusion of elimination and zero COVID in the short term, maybe in 20 years, maybe. What didn't work also was trying to save both so-called the economy and health. It's just not possible if without solving it. So we need to have kind of for the future, the principle, I would say, of societies living with the COVID while minimizing the fallout, and both not only counting the direct deaths, but all the what some will call collateral damage, which is enormous, and that's not being part of the equation. You know, from mental health issues, gender-based violence, you know, pushing lots of people further into poverty who were just above it, because we talk about those who made lots of money in the pandemic, but there's also the other side, you know. So I think that for policies, you can take at the global level, we clearly need a rethinking and a reorganization of global governance, and that affects the UN as well. And the WHO has to be strengthened, but how? And there is a very good report, I think, of the international panel, independent panel, IPPR, and for example, proposing a council of for global health threats at the level of heads of state, because that's the level that we need to deal with, so that we don't go for a kind of a narrow type of medical approach. We need better systems, and that's involvement. We need to invest in that. So investing in R&I, I mean, research and innovation. I mean, when you could argue one of the silver linings of this epidemic was the fact that we have vaccines now. But then the downside is that most people in the world who need it don't have access to it. So we need to have this end-to-end type of plan, so that the products of innovation will benefit the whole wide world. And then finally, I would say is that strengthening science advice and ensuring that it can remain independent. And although at the end of the day, I think these are political decisions and not technical issues. And that brings us back to not only the inequalities in democracies, but I think for the long term, it's very clear for me that we're entering an age of pandemics. And partly that is because of our inability to live in harmony with nature, that we're destroying it. And so when you bring together what's going on in terms of climate change, destruction of the environment, of biodiversity, and infections, it's going to get worse and worse. So we need this comprehensive approach. And that's where, it's like for Mami, something that you know very well. I mean, it's not only about dealing with disaster, but also preventing them and ensuring that the resilient societies. The more democratic a society is, the more it has systems, institutions, and and equality as a principle, the better we will be equipped to deal with pandemics. As if we add to that all the technical stuff, which is in essence probably the easier part. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. So what you were mentioning about strengthening science advice takes us really very smoothly into the next segment of our discussion, which is the nexus between the scientific community and the policymaking community. And throughout the pandemic, many politicians talked about the importance of following the science when implementing COVID-19 policy, but there has sometimes been a disconnect between the government policies and the scientific evidence. And as a result, some of the major systemic weakness of the science policy interface has become apparent in, unfortunately, many countries. And we're seeing a challenge of ensuring that policies are truly informed by science. So the question is, what can scientists do to ensure that evidence is better understood and taken up by policymakers? And on the other hand, what can policymakers do to put into practice evidence-based decision-making? And I'd like to first ask Claudio, and then after that, Christian, for your opinion. Claudio, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Mami. As science advisors, I think that we have to be extremely transparent about the limitations of our recommendations. We have to put ourselves in the shoes of policymakers and keep in mind that we are dealing with highly imperfect tools, and make this very clear. So the uncertainty associated with future predictions, for example, is extremely high, and the tools are also incomplete in incorporating all the dimensions at stake. So just to illustrate that, my first experience right at the beginning of the pandemic was to advise the board of directors in my institution regarding the immediate actions to take. So in this microcosmos, in this micro setting, closing the school would imply in everyday life dramas such as laying off the personnel working at the cafeteria that I saluted every day by their names, as well as the coffee shop attendant. And it was very difficult to recommend shutting down all the activities and at the same time have in mind all the implications that this would have in people's life. And as my second experience was in joining the board of advisors at the state level in the state where I live, in Rio de Janeiro. So after spending the night discussing the pros and cons of each alternative with the state health secretary, I woke up the next day and read in the newspapers that he had been arrested for corruption. So we have the pictures of the health secretary being arrested for corruption, and he was discussing with us the previous days about all the recommendations that we are offering them. And I also remember when I first mentioned to policymakers that the pandemic status quo could last for 2 years or more years. So this was a few months after the beginning of the outbreak in Brazil, and we had not very clear in our minds that this would be a very long process, and people was very surprised in learning that this would be a very long process. So I guess that the difficulty in expressing uncertainties regarding the future and conciliating conflicting recommendations is the big challenge that we see ahead of us as science advisors.
Thank you very much, Claudio. With those very, very difficult to even listen to examples. But Christian, can I direct the same question to you?
Yes, thank you. I just want to add a few aspects. I think it's a good idea to say follow the sciences, but we should not think that then we have the one solution. Because I posted a link to joint statement that we had with the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies, together with a group of chief science advisors for the European Commission and together with Peter Piot as well. It's one of 3 joint statements. The third one is just to come, but this one is on science advice. And we were very clear that it has to be a multidisciplinary science advice to politicians, that communication has to be clear and transparent and understandable for different populations in a region. And so not everyone is talking the same language, even the scientists among themselves. That we point to the facts where there are even uncertainties and unknowns and the unknown unknowns, that it has to be clear that there's always a weighing between different insights. So some of those who say follow the science perhaps mean follow the virologists or follow the epidemiologists, but follow the science is even more. And every science has values in it, in terms of the questions you pose, in terms of the methods you use, in terms of the answers you're striving for. And then you get answers to a specific question, but that has impacts on other issues that have value as well. Yeah, so is it better to avoid as many deaths as possible, or to save as many life years as possible, or to take care for the economic impact, to take care of poverty and so on as well, to take into account the work and living conditions as well. So insights are far away from being unanimous, yeah, and from being so clear. And I think to make this transparent, to discuss with people, to include citizens and to let them take part in decision making, to set up citizen panels or so to bring scientists together, not only with policymakers, but also with civil society, is, I think, key to coming forward with good pandemic management and also preparedness. And I completely agree with Peter that the next pandemic will come. And if we want to prepare, to be better prepared, we have to take so many aspects into account. That's why I'm very, very thankful and grateful for this International Science Council project on scenarios.
Thank you, Christian. And before going into the civil society issue, I wanted to ask you, Peter, I mean, we know that you have had a lot of interaction with the policymakers in public, behind the scenes, and I'm not going to ask you to disclose any state secret, but in a nutshell, did you find that as the pandemic evolved, the nexus or the relationship between the scientific community and the policymaking community got better, or depending on each different stage, there were always different challenges? Sorry, Peter, I think you might be.
Yes, I was muted. Sorry. I would say that there are always challenges, and I agree with Christiane. Even the definition of what we mean by science advice is very different, whether you talk to a virologist, a mathematical modeler, or a political scientist, or etc. And I learned it the hard way because I worked a lot on AIDS, as you saw, and where also the tension between scientific policy advice and the politics of it was there was nearly always enormous tension in nearly every society, because whatever we would come up with, what to do with in terms of HIV, we would touch on some fundamental issues for many cultures. And in the case of HIV, it has a lot to do with sex or sexuality, but also then you go into gender, etc., etc. And so what I see is here is that there is always a very delicate interaction. And I always say that some scientists, they think that they are the ones that are decision makers. I said, no, you're an advisor. If as a scientist, you want to take decisions, you go into politics. and you try to be elected and you do it. We are advisors and we are citizens, and we have to really connect also far more. And I know that's for the next session. And again, coming from the AIDS movement, for me, involving civil society is really key. And that has been very absent from this epidemic, I would say, in most countries. So I would say that the interaction is, it changes. And for example, now here in the UK, where the Prime Minister has announced that freedom, as it's called, you know, on the 19th of July, and even and leave it to individual citizens to decide whether to wear masks and so on. Now, scientists are in general think that it's a very risky proposition. So I think that initially there was not much interest from politicians because it was not clear that this would become such a huge issue. And then it was kind of delegated to scientists on the margins. And then, you know, I think we probably, after a few years' time, it would be interesting to see the cycles, and in different cultures. It's a big difference where there's accountability through the media or parliament or through a party or whatever, and how that interaction is. But it is, I think that it's very important, I think, to document how that is going on, because we will need that and refine that these interactions for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So both you and Christian talked about the civil society. So now we'd like to go into the next important segment of civil society engagement in policy making, because the pandemic has shown tragedies, but also the resilience in societies and the capacity for solidarity and cohesion in times of crisis. And here we know that this is an area where the civil society has a very important role in mitigating the consequences of any crisis and this pandemic as well, while increasing solidarity and togetherness. And they can also empower and co-design policies towards the solutions for the pandemic, and also promote participation in the democratic process. And my question goes to Elizabeth, which is, how can civil society be better engaged in the development of such policies? We have heard about how they were seen as a bit absent, but Elizabeth, do you have the same opinion? But would there be any success stories that you can share with us?
Let me go a step back and say that the outcomes, what we are looking for is societal well-being as a broad concept. And societal well-being or mal-being is never the product of one vector. It's a co-production. And this, I take this word co-production from, it's a concept that is cherished in the field of science and technology studies. And these forces are economic, political, societal, including science. Science, however, is only one of the components. And the pandemic led, as Peter said, to more visibility and legitimacy of the scientific discourse, yet not to a privileged position in decision-making, and especially not in implementations. Perhaps then we should think of scientific knowledge, which is never certainty, but it's uncertain, and there is always controversies within the scientific community itself. It has to be conceived as one form of knowledge that circulates and interacts with other knowledges. In Spanish, we have two words. One is conocimiento, knowledge, and the other is saberes, which may be practical, empirical, or even at the extreme, religious and other beliefs that may go even against science. So taking this into account, what is civil society and what is the role of civil society? I will not go into the concept itself, yet to mention that there is a diversity of actors, of scales of action, and to the contribution to evidence-based knowledge. I do not refer here to the big foundations, rich that may be stakeholders in major decisions. I refer more to social organizations concerned with societal well-being that existed before the pandemic and developed ways to approach everyday life, especially of vulnerable people, with one basic aim: caring for people. I think that the notion of care is highly significant and will become even more significant as time goes on for anything related to pandemics. These organizations run from Oxfam or Médecins Sans Frontières at the global level. There is Human Rights Watch, women's organization, environmental networks, and it runs from these large world organizations to grassroots organizations in charge of soup kitchens and primary care, not only medical primary care, in a refugee camp or in a local neighborhood in a large city. So how to incorporate civil society of this type of organizations? They are already involved. They are already involved in everyday life. If you look at what Médecins Sans Frontières are doing and what they are and the way they are handling the pandemic, they are involved. The thing is that we can think of two models. One is that scientists and policymakers know what should be done, and these organizations are seen as intermediaries to spread the word and enact policies so as to reach populations, difficult populations, at a low cost. So it's a cost efficiency way of looking at civil society. This was the way, actually, neoliberal global and national governance bodies were ready to implement, trying to shrink the costs of the states and the welfare measures that are embodied in a notion of universal human rights. Alternatively, and I think this is the model that we should look at, it is important to recognize that these organizations have a significant stock of knowledge, of knowledges. And I would risk to say that they, in tandem with social scientists, are the ones who understand how people operate in their everyday life and should be engaged in the co-production of knowledge, not in spreading the word. So the contrast is not only between neoliberal views of the world and the germs of solidarity and a better world. It will lead, if we look at it this way, to better knowledge and to better practices.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And indeed, now we're talking about practitioners. But Claudio, I wanted to ask you, because you shared with us that, let's say, the challenges that your country faced at the national state level as well. Did you see the role of civil society coming out in these circumstances?
Yes, I do see, and I'm very optimistic about that. The first change that I was able to perceive was a change in the press. So the same press that worked in favor of the election of President Bolsonaro is now being extremely precise and useful in spreading the news about all the recommendations. So they are very precise in what they are saying, and it's very good. It's a very good reflection of the consensual recommendations that we see everywhere. So this is worked as a sort of a mystery to me, how the same press can behave in different ways regarding the same situation. And I think that this has to do with the fact that this process pushed the society so much towards its almost breaking down, almost its collapse, that people are now perceiving that there is only one way of getting out of this big mess that we are into. And I think that people's minds are changing, and we might see some way out from this big trouble that we got ourselves into.
Thank you, Claudio. And Christian, you already talked about a bit about the civil society, but do you think that globally and or in Europe, after, let's say, or even from now, do you see a stronger role of the civil society in formulating policies that will govern our lives?
I think this is a very important question, and we cannot answer this globally, I suppose, because it's very, very different in different regions and countries due to political circumstances, due to education and so on, and due to the living conditions and so on. But I think it's important to foster, for example, institutions like citizen councils in a city, in a region, in a country, or even in Europe, Africa, and so on. So at different governance levels to include them, because they have usually much better ideas and more ideas than those who do that professionally, because they just have another view through another corner. And we had in Germany, for example, a hackathon, We versus Virus hackathon, with 1,500 projects coming out of that digitally, that were then supported financially from our ministries. Yeah, so some projects where the support in a city or in a part of a city was in a solidaristic way organized, where resources were collected and then distributed according to good criteria. And there were a lot of initiatives that helped people to deal with home office, homeschooling, to support each other, to buy things and so on. And there's another thing. What I think is that that we can use platforms and digital platforms to foster that. For gene editing, there was this proposition, and it is already established, to build up a global observatory on gene editing, to foster societal debate and to listen to those who are usually not listened to because they don't have access to. Then, of course, we have to take into account the digital divide, and that not all people have access to these tools, but this has to be fostered, of course. And I think all those possibilities of participation, of co-creation, as Elizabeth said, and so on, have to be strengthened, because citizens, and we can establish ambassadors, citizen ambassadors in regions. Let's take the example of vaccination. So there's really a great inequality in the distribution of vaccines globally, but also within the country. So we had in Germany now the effect that less than 50% of people with lower income have access to vaccines, or have at least one vaccine administered, but more than 70% of those with high income. Yeah, let alone the disastrous situation in Africa and South Asia. Yeah, but already there we have these inequalities. And why don't we have mobile teams, or not enough at least, mobile teams going with the vaccination to those schools, companies, or parts of a city where people don't have good access to healthcare? Yeah, the WHO has, of course, great programs for healthcare, strengthening healthcare systems and so on. But sometimes it's not only about the global view, but on local engagement. And there are citizen ambassadors who speak the language of those with migration background, to speak the language of those who live in that region, are very important and can support policymakers a lot.
Thank you very much, Christian. So we're talking about governance at large, and we're talking about science, but scientists, but citizens, cities, a lot coming into the governance that we need to think about. But let us go into the last segment, and which is about the COVID outcome scenario zone, future COVID scenarios. Peter already told us that we have to have a long-term view, because if we don't, we will not be taking the right decisions. The policymakers, the citizens will not behaving in the right way, because we still have a long and winding road ahead of us. And how long and bumpy this road will be really is going to be determined by the decisions and behaviors. And I'm sure that, you know, there will be many possible outcomes that we can talk about. But Ines, I'd like to ask you here, I'm sure that there have been a lot of interesting views coming out from the audience. Can you enlighten us about that a bit? And what question do we have from the audience?
Thank you, Mami. Yes, we do. We have a number of questions. The first question comes from Marcelo Sabanes, and he says, under the current global context and the lack of leadership at the national level, the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Office have another opportunity to increase the work at the local level, helping cities to be more resilient in front of future pandemics and other disasters. And so he's asking, are you encouraging cities to apply the scorecard developed for the health sector and build a resilience plan after that, providing also support for its implementation?
Thank you, Ines. I think that might be a question that I could answer. So indeed, UNDRR, we have been talking about the resilience at the central and local level, because that is what is in the Sendai framework. And we ran a 10-year campaign called Making Cities Resilient from 2010 to last year. And now we have a new one, which is called MCR 2030. And in these campaigns, we are trying to strengthen the local resilience through the scorecards that just has been mentioned. And I think that this pandemic has really shown that the resilience at the local level, cities, and also importantly, communities has been highlighted. So yes, indeed, we are encouraging these cities to join the campaign and to build their resilience together. Ines, any other question that you might want to give us, or?
Yeah, one more question. So someone asked, many of you mentioned that the inequalities as a result of this pandemic is a really serious issue, and that came up in our research for the COVID outcome scenario project as well. It comes up again and again. But we all know that a lot of the kind of public health measures or the policies that governments put in place, it's a trade-off between, you know, the needs of various different groups, and also governments will be balancing kind of the desires of their population, you know, in the run-up to the next election cycle. And so because we know these inequalities are increasing and some of these issues will impact minority, more vulnerable groups more, how is it, do you think, that we can convince the population, I think, who are the really kind of the powerful group here, to kind of be concerned more about some of the issues that might impact minority groups?
Thank you for that question. Peter, may I ask?
Well, I'll try, but I think there's no magic solution. But I'd like to say something also about this for the population. So that's is in the question. And when we think of civil society, there are also in civil society populist forces, people who are against what would be for the benefit of everybody, and certainly of minority population. So we should also be realistic about what civil society is there. But the key is to involve the people who are the most affected. In my mother tongue is Dutch, and we have a term, ervaringsdeskundige, means an experienced expert. People who are you know, in vulnerable populations or have experienced the problems and so themselves. And I'm thinking here, you make a comparison with climate change and action on climate change, because often what makes very good sense in mathematical models and all that, and to bring down the increase in temperature, affects disproportionately the most vulnerable. Not only are they the most affected by climate change or by the epidemic, but also the measures are actually affecting them in a more negative way than, let's say, people are better off. So that's why I think in both areas, every policy needs to have that kind. Does it pass the test of, you know, let's say, countering inequality? And I'm always an optimist, and I always think then, okay, in crisis, we can then use that to reduce these inequalities so that we're, you know, that the resilience at the various levels is increased. But that's a purely political decision then. And that's where, you know, you can't separate all this technical and scientific thing from the political action. And that's a matter of values then in each society. But that's also something that where we as scientists and science advisors, the least we have to do is to alert those in power to say, look, if you decide you go for A, have you thought of the impact, negative impact for those and those and those populations? It may be that they couldn't care less, which is sometimes the case. But at least that's our responsibility, that we show that what the implications are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So now here I'd like to ask to all our panelists, this question is, we know that there is no quick solution. And based on that, what is your key message for policymakers to find a pathway for a realistically optimistic outcome for the world? It's not an easy question, but what is your key message there for policymakers? And I'm going to please ask in the order of Claudio, Christian, Elizabeth, and Peter. So Claudio, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I guess that we can always dream. And so the key message that I would have in mind is to aim at a more equal society, a more homogeneous world. And of course, this is very difficult. And we also have to realize how much connected we are. So I had previously used the expression that Brazil was a testing site for what's going on. And I can identify several connections, several links between what's going on in Brazil and what's going on in other societies, including the main economy. So what's going on, for example, in Germany, what's going on in the US. So there are lots of movements that are going on in the society that are very similar to what happens there. And of course, the environment is one of the big issues in the Brazilian society and in the wider society as well, given that the Amazon is under a very, very serious threat. And since we are all connected, and since there is no way that you can control the dynamics of an outbreak in one place without controlling it everywhere, so we would be never safe if transmission is going on some other place. We have no other option, no other way but trying to overcome this concentration of wealth and aiming at a more homogeneous world. So this would be my main message.
Thank you very much, Claudio. Christian.
Yeah, thank you. So if I am allowed to dream, I would say that I would like to see a treaty on pandemics on the level of the United Nations, where institutions are built up to monitor, to prepare for, and to manage a pandemic. Of course, including all the structures and institutions and governance models we already have, but they are obviously not enough. So this has to be fostered. The EGE and GCSA and Peter Piot, in our second statement, we suggested an international financing instrument for vaccine distribution and for essential medical resources like vaccines, but others as well. We could have an international treaty on the distribution of vaccines, binding the companies as well, implementing no-fault compensation schemes and so on. So there are so much institutional issues that could be done to foster the management. And my very last sentence is, I think that education is key. So not only for this pandemic, also for the climate crisis, for climate change, for so many political and economical and social issues, education of all the people of the world is key. And so we have to focus on strengthening people to take their own life in their hands, to have the capabilities to do that, to build up competencies and, for example, production capacities for vaccines in Africa, in the different regions of the world. So yes, I think education is key. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christian. So now, Elizabeth, what is your key message for policymakers to find a pathway for an optimistic outcome?
Well, the messages are specific to the pandemic. I leave this for the experts, but I think that I would stress the point that Claudio made at the beginning, that is, there will be no solution and no way forward if we do not deal with inequalities in the world, that is, with global and local inequalities. I think that this pandemic has shown that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and there is a limit to resilience. There is a limit when there are no resources. Resilience is a concept that does not apply. So I would say that the message is we have to think in terms of seeing this, the health issue and the pandemic, as part of a much larger concern with inequalities in the world and with what people, humanity, but basically the rich are doing to the environment, and how to solve in a tandem issues of global economic and social inequalities.
Thank you. And indeed, what we saw during the pandemic is that we are living in this multi-hazard world where the pandemic is there and all the climate emergency related disasters are there. And again, in there where inequality is, vulnerability is, the most vulnerable are disproportionately affected. So indeed, we need to look at this big picture. But last but not least, Peter, please, can we listen to your key message for policymakers to find a pathway for an optimistic outcome?
Yes, thank you, Mami. I would say, first of all, everything that was said before should be part of it. So I try not to repeat it. So because I agree with it all. But 3 points maybe that were not mentioned explicitly. One is to take the long-term view when you take acute decisions. Several countries have, started with the complete lockdown. So you know what you started, but there was no exit strategy, not thinking through how to get out of it, and now they're stuck. So that's take that long-term view. That's why we need the scenarios from the that we're trying to make with our International Science Council. Secondly, I think that to come back to an earlier discussion, this conversation is that involve the citizens, and I won't go into what we've talked about. And thirdly, you know, use the crisis. Never miss a good crisis. But use that crisis to reduce vulnerabilities and inequalities, because you can, you know, you can actually get consensus for policies and actions and funding that during a crisis time that are far more difficult to achieve, you know, in peacetime, to put it that way, also because the inequalities are so more striking. I'll stop here, but for the rest, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I was given a task to wrap up, but I dare not wrap up because following, you know, Peter's sage advice that, you know, we should be taking a long-term view, and so wrapping up now is really not what we need to do now. So I think the first message is, of course, we have still a long way to go. And that all of us, not only the policymakers, but each and every one of us, the citizens, need to understand this. And of course, you know, again, you know, we have talked about science, but not one science, different kinds of science, sometimes even, you know, debating amongst themselves. But it is sure that it will make a major contribution to the challenge that we're facing. And Christine, you talked about education, and I think, you know, we need to be educated, we need to empower ourselves, and in there, science evidence is so important. And of course, you know, we talked about co-creation, cooperation, co-production, which is the case of all important things that need to happen, but in overcoming a crisis, I think, you know, that is key. And there was a lot of discussion about the inequality. I think, you know, it's really, really something that has become so clear, but unfortunately getting worse. So here we do need to think about, well, maybe too early to talk about recovery following what Peter and everybody is saying, but if the recovery is not really resilient, but as Elizabeth said, you can't talk about resilience if we're not going to be around. We have to think about a resilient, equitable, green recovery. From the UNDRR perspective, I've been here in my job for about 3 years, and it's been very difficult and still difficult to convince people of the importance of prevention and the benefit of prevention. The silver lining, we think, is that there is more awareness about the importance of prevention, but whether it becomes a reality is really in our hands. It's a test. My final and most important message to the people who have been listening to us, and thank you very much, is that the important COVID-19 outcome scenario project, we are mapping the possible paths ahead in order to inform decisions that will influence the outcome of the pandemic. And with their findings, this will be released later in the year, autumn, around October. So please watch the space. It's not an easy exercise, but we have all these distinguished members, all the panelists here today with us, and many more who are on this project. So please look forward, but in the meantime, let's make sure that each one of us is responsible for the outcome and how we behave. So thank you very much once again to all the panelists, Peter, Claudio, Christiane, Elizabeth, and also Ines. And I would like to close this very important event. Thank you very much, and please stay safe.